right. So I kind of wanted to touch upon just in general, like what I've kind of surmised from like the different models that we've talked about on like self-awareness and kind of development of identity. And I think it's interesting the fact that we've brought up that in a lot of these models, it's not some linear progression, and that at times people can go back and forth between different stages. And I think that is something to be really conscious and aware of when we're working with clients, that maybe certain events, if we're thinking maybe like on a Bronfenbrenner kind of model, like maybe certain events in their lives, whether, more global, or, more proximal to their kind of, so maybe like, in the larger culture, like certain current events may change the way an individual views themselves or interacts with the world. And, and they may go back to, or I don't want to say go back, but they may go to a phase that people see as a little bit more less developed in an aspect of their identity, or maybe it's something that happens on a more personal level, like with family members or friends, or maybe something that has to do with their professional life. And I think that's another, I don't know, like I keep going back to this assumptions piece in how we construct or operationalize our kind of our view of a client. And that I think oftentimes maybe we've been seeing a client for a really long time, and we've seen a lot of what we see as growth in that individual, but maybe we have to be careful to not see these models as linear and progressive, and that each stage is progress to an extent, because I think there's damage when we potentially think that if a client is more in another stage than they have been in the past, or has gone back to a stage that they were in the past, that's regressive. But because potentially there are things that client can gain from being in that space that might mean a deeper progress for them. That I think maybe they wouldn't be in a space to learn certain things about themselves or about their world if they just stayed in one phase of identity that we conceptualize as being maybe higher order or more developed, more advanced. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about. And I think, another thing that can be dangerous when we begin to believe that, one phase or one stage is superior to another is that, maybe that this individual isn't capable of this kind of growth, or maybe this individual isn't capable of this kind of potential, or, I think it's good to kind of be aware of like maybe what certain characteristics make up a stage, but to not believe, I think it's dangerous to believe that maybe like that individual is only capable of those characteristics within that stage, because honestly, I think those stages are constructed out of a general understanding of generally how are people in certain aspects of their development. So like I think we have to be open to the uniqueness of each individual that we're working with, and I think that's why it's so important to consistently, kind of keep our minds open to who an individual is, and to also continually operationalize who that individual is. While it's good to be aware of certain frameworks and certain ways of seeing people and understanding people, because that can kind of give us maybe a launching point to work off of, and maybe a way to understand potentially how this individual might respond to certain things. I think it can be limiting. I think it's a balance between that. In general, like as counselors, there's always a balance to be achieved between having a structure, just in general with your practice, but also just with each session, like having an idea of what you want to talk about, but you always have to have a certain level of openness to whatever is presented in each session, or whatever is presented with that client. Or it's kind of, it's interesting to think about. So I think, in general, I think it's hard, especially personally as a PhD student. We rely so heavily on what we know of the research and what we know from our data, that sometimes we forget that, this data and this research, while it should be representative of most individuals, it's still generalizations for the most part, unless it's single subject design, and even then it's still supposed to be representative to an extent. And so I think even with that, we have to be kind of in this in-between of accepting what the research says or being aware of it, but also being aware that people deviate all the time from our expectations and norms. But anyways, thanks.